You know that specific moment when someone asks about the holiday, where you went, how long you stayed, what it was like, and gives an answer that has clearly been assembled, at least partially, for this conversation. The destination that lands well in a sentence. The hotel that sounds impressive without requiring explanation. And you think about your own answer before they ask. Where you went was chosen because you wanted to go there. The hotel was chosen because it fit what the trip needed. Nobody whose opinion would have mattered was consulted in the decision. Not because you don't care what people think, but because that variable was removed from the equation a long time ago. The spending happened. It just happened without an audience, as part of the calculation. While somewhere in the conversation, someone is already planning the next trip around what the photographs will look like when it's over. Here is what almost nobody calculates about spending to impress. The audience is expensive. Not in any single purchase, not in any one decision that could be pointed to and called the problem, but across a life of decisions where the opinion of others was one of the inputs, the car that was one level above what was needed, the neighborhood chosen partly for what the address communicated, the holiday that cost twice as much because the destination was more recognizable than the alternative, the watch, the bag, the renovation, all of them reasonable individually, all of them carrying a premium that was never for the owner. Research on consumer spending consistently finds that between 30 and 40% of decisions in high-value categories, cars, housing, travel, clothing, include as a primary factor what the purchase will signal to others. Not as a secondary consideration, as a primary one. The object purchased and the signal sent are for many buyers inseparable. The premium for the signal is real, it is consistent, and it is almost never accounted for as a separate cost because it arrives bundled inside the price of the thing itself, invisible as a line item, present in every purchase where what others will think was part of what was being bought. Nobody at the point of sale separates those two numbers for you. The price of the thing and the price of the signal arrive together as a single figure on a single receipt, and the signal's share of that figure is never itemized, never discussed, and almost never noticed until the purchase has already been made and the audience has already moved on. You only meet the full cost later, quietly, across years of decisions where the audience was always included in the price and never once said thank you for it. There is a name for why spending to impress is so difficult to stop, even when the logic of stopping is completely clear. Economists call it signaling. Research by Michael Spence, who received the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2001, showed that in situations of incomplete information, people use observable signals to communicate qualities that cannot be directly verified. Consumption is one of the most visible and universal signals available. What you drive, where you live, what you wear, where you travel, all of it communicates constantly to everyone who can see it. The signal is not irrational. In social environments where status matters, sending the right signal opens doors and generates social proof that is genuinely useful. The problem is not that signaling exists. The problem is that the signal costs money, goes to the audience instead of the owner, and requires constant renewal as the reference point shifts upward. Removing the signal from the spending decision is not antisocial. It is recognizing that you have been paying for something you never owned and deciding to stop paying. And signaling holds its power because of what the culture has already decided successful people are supposed to look like. For decades, the social script has been consistent. The person who spends visibly is doing the expected thing. The person who doesn't is either struggling or eccentric. Choosing a car for what it does rather than what it signals is read not as financial intelligence, but as an absence of ambition. Never spending to impress is not austerity. It is the specific refusal to let the audience's expectations become a line item in every budget, to insist that what is purchased for the person buying it and no one else. And the numbers confirm what the refusal already knew. The premium on the signaling version of almost every product category is measurable and consistent. The car that communicates success costs more than the car that provides transport. The holiday that photographs well costs more than the one that restores. In every case, the difference is the cost of the signal, paid by the buyer, received by the audience. 3 forces. A brain wired to use spending as communication. A culture that reads conspicuous consumption as success and restraint as limitation. And a lifetime premium paid for signals that depreciated the moment the audience moved on, quietly proving that the audience was the most expensive thing that was never on the receipt. It was there, the car purchase, that nobody commented on. Not because the car was embarrassing, but because it was simply a car, chosen for what it did rather than what it said. And the absence of comment was not a disappointment, but a confirmation that the right question had been asked, and that the answer, arrived at without anyone else's input, had turned out to be more than enough for every purpose the car was actually going to serve. It was there, the holiday that was never posted, not as a statement, not because sharing is wrong, but because the trip was assembled entirely around what was wanted from it. And what was wanted from it had nothing to do with what would look good in a photograph to people who were not there. It was there, the moment of realizing that a particular purchase, something that had been considered for months, had been considered almost entirely in terms of what others would think of it. And that when that variable was removed from the calculation, the desire for the thing largely disappeared with it. The thing had been wanted for an audience. Without the audience present, it was simply an expensive object quietly solving a problem that didn't really exist. It was there, the specific freedom of a spending decision made without consulting anyone. Not from indifference to others, but from a clear understanding that the people whose opinion would have been consulted were not paying the bill, would not be using the thing, and would have moved on to a different reference point long before the purchase had finished being useful. These are not people who don't care about quality. Most of them spend deliberately and sometimes generously on things that do what they are supposed to do, that last, that serve the purpose they were bought for. What they have removed from every spending decision is a single variable. What will this communicate to people who are watching? They are the person who, asked why they drive what they drive, or live where they live, or travel where they travel, gives a reason instead of a signal. Something close to this. It does what I need it to do. I bought it for me, not for anyone else. That's the whole calculation. That is not someone without ambition or taste. That is someone who separated the spending from the performance, who found that once the audience was removed from the equation, the decisions became considerably simpler and considerably cheaper without becoming worse. They do not check whether a purchase will impress anyone before making it. The question was retired a long time ago, replaced by a simpler one that has been answering itself ever since. Is this for me, or is it for the version of me that other people see? And the answer, arrived at honestly, tends to make the decision faster, cheaper, and considerably easier to live with, because nobody is performing for an audience that was never paying attention in the way the spending assumed. And the next time a spending decision arrives with an audience already built into it, that question already knows which variable to remove. Now, finally, the objection. There's nothing wrong with wanting nice things. Quality costs money, and some spending is genuinely about treating yourself, not performing for anyone. This is not about people who spend generously or choose quality quite deliberately. If the spending is for the experience, the durability, the genuine pleasure of the thing itself, nothing here is arguing against that. This is about the very specific variable that was removed from the equation. Not what others will think, but what this actually does for the person buying it. And the distinction carries more weight than the objection assumes. Some expensive things are worth every dollar. The question is whether you'd still buy them if nobody ever knew. Most purchases survive that test. The ones that don't, the ones that quietly lose their appeal when the audience is removed, are precisely the purchases this is about. And that distinction, once honestly noticed, tends to change the calculation on a surprisingly large number of decisions that had seemed entirely and obviously about the thing itself. The people who never spend to impress anyone are not depriving themselves of anything that genuinely mattered. They are simply refusing to fund an audience that was never going to stay, with money that could have gone anywhere else. Here is what most people get backwards. The person who spends visibly, who drives the car that signals, lives in the address that signals, wears the thing that signals, is not more successful. They are simply paying more for the same utility and directing the premium toward an audience that will have moved on to a new reference point by the time the purchase has finished depreciating. The person who removed the audience from the equation is not living with less of anything that matters. They are spending on what they chose, not on what the moment required them to be seen choosing. Most people aren't really concerned with actually doing better. They're far more concerned with looking like they're already doing better. And the person who made that clear separation is not austere or indifferent or without standards. They simply stopped paying for a seat in a performance they were never the audience for, and found, without particular drama, that the money went considerably further once the theater closed and the real spending could begin. There is a moment people who never spend to impress all describe in almost the same way. It is not the first purchase made without consulting anyone. It is not the moment a decision became noticeably simpler. It is an ordinary afternoon, a purchase considered, evaluated, and made entirely on the basis of what it does, what it costs, and whether it is wanted, and realizing that no other variable had entered the calculation. Not once, not even briefly. Not minimalism, not austerity, not a philosophy that needed announcing, just the specific, quiet absence of a question that used to be part of every spending decision. What will this say about me to the people who see it? And the realization that its absence had not made a single purchase worse. Not because the audience doesn't exist, because it was never consulted, and the spending was better for it. The audience was never the point. What spending without one said about everything else was. 10 years from now, nobody asks what you spent to impress them. They ask whether you ever once bought something entirely for yourself, with no audience in mind, no signal intended, and whether the thing was better for it. Have you ever caught yourself spending to impress someone? And what happened when you noticed? Has anyone ever made you feel like spending less, visibly, was somehow falling behind? Drop it below. We read every single one.